Devin, we're about to hear from Lori White. Let's listen. Special prosecutor.
The court, after the district attorney's office was recused, I'm a retired judge here, and this is a grand jury that was at the end of their 6-month term, and they chose to investigate. The judge, and I know all of you media were very unhappy that the judge closed off the court. I wasn't the judge for that. I'm the prosecutor. There were issues with several of you looking into the grand jury room, and their anonymity and the secrecy of the grand jury proceedings is tantamount. And so the court ordered that the security of them, and because you all were parked at their cars, we did not want them bothered. So we did not want you filming them. They have a right to privacy. So then there were some other issues because media failed to leave. So there were several of y'all that were arrested, and I helped get you out of the arrest. So please leave.
But Article 383 allows us to be in there during a grand jury return. Does it not, Judge?
You want me to talk? I'm the prosecutor, not the judge. Take it up with the court. When there are security issues, security is tantamount in this building, and also anonymity for the grand jury. So the grand jury returned a 16-count indictment today. It will be online. Y'all probably already reported about it. We're very interested in elected officials in New Orleans not being intimidated or threatened by letter or any other way. And we conducted this hearing, and it's going to be very simple, very open and shut. Nothing difficult about it. It's all, you all probably have all the information now. It's based on the letters that the AG sent to 5 city council, the mayor, the DA, and Judge Johnson, and that's Calvin Johnson.
But Judge, is this the weaponization of politics in the court system? Should this be a criminal matter?
The grand jury has returned an indictment. It is now a criminal matter.
What do you say to government?
How did the grand jury decide to investigate this?
On their own,
What do you say to
which they have by authority to do.
Was it because of Mayor Moreno's post on Instagram?
I can't answer that.
What do you say to the governor calling this a kangaroo court that he plans to pardon the AG no matter what?
Well, good. Let's get her convicted, and then he can pardon her.
This is an indictment based on allegations of intimidation, and you just saw the court handcuff several reporters.
The court did not handcuff any reporters. You all were handcuffed by sheriff's deputies because you would not obey an order.
Does that cast any questions on the...
Well, the interesting thing is, it's a question of you all weren't willing to walk out when you were asked to do...
We have a right to object, do we not, if it's not following Canon 383?
Want to hear about the case?
I do. Can you give us a rundown of the charges and what happens to charges?
We're waiting for the Attorney General to post bond and for her to be notified, and I think she's already got counsel here.
Judge, do you know when the Attorney General was notified? Has she been notified previously that she was being investigated?
Have no idea.
Do you know where she's being processed?
Have no idea. She's not being processed.
Sorry, do you believe a letter could actually be threatening to an individual?
Grand jury returned an indictment of 16 counts. It's going to be up to a jury now.
In most cases, when it comes to this, usually those kind of intimidation would be more towards like physical. I mean, do you believe that there was a threat to harm?
The grand jury put it in a grand jury indictment. You all can read it, and then the facts will fill it in.
What are the charges?
There's 16 of them. There's 16. I told you what they were at the beginning of this.
How much was the bond?
The judge set a $25,000 bond on each count. I think that's $400,000.
And so then there'll be an arraignment next?
Of course, it's just like any criminal defendant that shows up at this courthouse. She'll be charged just like Susan Hudson, any elected official, or any other individual.
Do you expect, like in the Susan Hudson case, there could be a problem with judges recusing themselves, getting this seen in a timely manner?
There'll be a lot of things going on.
Were there any challenges that you had during the presentation of this matter to the grand jury?
I have challenges every day.
Do you expect the governor to pardon her if she is convicted?
I don't know. I don't know what he thinks.
And you'll continue as the special prosecutor?
I was appointed special prosecutor, yes, until I...
What was your reaction when you were appointed? Were you surprised?
I didn't even know what I was being appointed for. This will teach you not to say yes when people call and ask you, what are you doing today? Can you come into town? I have something I think you'd be great for. So don't ever let people tell you you're good at something, because then you might show up and your ego gets you in the middle of this.
When does this stop? Does it ramp up, continue to ramp up over and over? I mean, there are threats this way, threats that way. When does it end?
I think there's a whole lot going on in the nation, and I think there's, at some point, things have to stop.
Do you think you have a strong case? You had enough to get an indictment from a
Grand jury thought
but
we
a
had
conviction
enough
is-
evidence that was presented.
Some may
I'm not the jury or the judge anymore. I get to be the prosecutor.
Some may say that this could be a waste of tax dollars on both sides because we just constantly fight with the state fights with New Orleans. What would you say to that?
Well, aren't we a little tired as New Orleanians also having everyone in the state kicking New Orleans? And why would we want people to be afraid to run for office if they're going to be intimidated?
But are you worried that now Attorney General Murrill could use the power of the state to come after you or other members of the local administration?
I worry every day about myself. How about you?
What are the actual charges that the indictment alleges?
Malfeasance in office, 8 counts, and intimidation and retaliation, 8 counts. Anything else? Can't think of anything smart else to ask.
Do you believe that the grand jury made the right decision?
I did what the grand jury advised me to do after they heard the evidence. And as a prosecutor, kind of like a judge, I didn't get to have feelings. I had to follow the law.
Do you believe, since we are in Orleans Parish, obviously a lot of people have a lot of distrust or dislike towards the state, that they would automatically go and believe that, hey, she should be indicted just because of that?
I don't think about that. I know that we at this courthouse have suffered a lot of different things, that our voters, and the grand jury was made up of voters of this parish, and they obviously thought that this was important enough to spend time on, and then they returned an indictment, and I followed what they asked me to do.
As someone very familiar with the comings and goings of court and media, do you agree with the deputy's decision to forcibly evacuate reporters from the hallway, not inside the courtroom, the hallway?
Have you ever seen a forcible evacuation? Because I didn't see one today.
I just saw a reporter put in handcuffs, and we were all...
That was not a forcible evacuation. All right, thanks,
What
y'all.
would you call that?
Take care.
So that is former criminal court judge Lori White. That's former criminal court judge Lori White. She was actually brought in by Judge Leon Roche apparently as a special counsel because District Attorney Jason Williams had to recuse himself because he was involved in this back and forth and the threats for prosecution from Liz Murrill. Now, I want to clarify something very important. Hold on a second. Let's get
the Attorney General in this matter. Unfortunately, we were not allowed in the courtroom. The courtroom was locked. We had expected to request to move for a stay of these proceedings. There are some serious issues that are going on with this particular indictment, aside from the fact of how embarrassing this is for the city of New Orleans. It is also a complete misuse of the criminal justice system for various reasons. We attempted to go back into the courtroom after the bond was issued, and we were told by Judge Roche we were not allowed in, that we could see ourselves out of the courtroom. So we are expecting to file emergency proceedings in this matter. There are several concerning matters that hopefully you all will begin to look into involving conflicts of interest. Not only that, but involving tampering with the grand jury. We have a conflict of interest of Judge Roche himself here, who oversees 38 cases that the Attorney General is prosecuting in his section of court. At the same time, he has hand-selected a special prosecutor to indict the Attorney General. So we have a conflict of a conflict of interest with the judge here. He has also been reported, and it has been reported to the Attorney General, that he has engaged in conducting fake trials as a judge in criminal district court. All of those create a pretty serious conflict of interest for the judge. In addition to that, he hand-selected former Judge Lori White to be the special prosecutor in this matter, who is currently represented by the Attorney General in a civil matter in which she is accused of sexual harassment. That matter was in court as recent as last week. it is incumbent upon Judge Roche to determine if there are any conflicts of interest before appointing a special prosecutor. We certainly expect that that would have happened in this case, and we see that it did not. So we have serious concerns here, aside from the fact that we have reporting in the newspaper and given by Special Prosecutor Lori White herself communications directly from grand jurors. It is against the law to violate the secrecy of a grand jury. We know that grand jurors are communicating with people and influencing investigations, whether it be them directly or through the influence of other people outside of that grand jury. We have that being reported directly from the media, that grand jury is speaking to members outside of that grand jury. That's a very, very serious problem, and it will affect the integrity of every indictment that came out of that particular grand jury. That's very concerning to the public. All of these matters we had expected and hoped to raise in front of Judge Roche. It is no surprise that he locked the door and kept us out in an effort to keep that from being placed on the record. We expect to file emergency motions in this matter to have those issues heard by a higher court.
What about the fact that the grand jury indictment was handed up in a sealed courtroom, and when we objected, our investigative producer was handcuffed?
I think it's very telling. I wasn't there for that incident. It doesn't surprise me, though. We were treated similarly when we attempted to go into Judge Roche's courtroom. It certainly shows that they're attempting to isolate and hide what's going on here. I would be, too, if I were them, given what has recently come out in terms of just alone the conflicts of interest. Very alarming conflicts coming not only from the judge, but from the special prosecutor herself, and the fact that we have grand jurors leaking information to the public. So that's going to have really lasting effects on a lot of prosecutions, and a lot of people should be asking about the integrity of what's happening in the grand jury. How often is this happening? How many other indictments could be affected by this? Is this a standard practice? All of those very concerning things, and the fact that they are making such a deliberate effort to keep the media out of that courtroom speaks volumes.
When does this stop escalating? It keeps escalating. There are threats of prosecution, then now there is prosecution. When does this stop?
I think this is, a very desperate attempt for attention. We see that in New Orleans, really a misuse of the criminal justice system. It should be alarming to everybody that this is how the criminal justice system could be manipulated in a circumstance like this. I see this is obviously an attention grab here, politically motivated, and so it's unfortunate that something like this could ultimately lead to affecting further investigations. Maybe it was necessary to happen, though, because I think the public should definitely know what's going on in criminal court. I think it's important for us to see this firsthand, and I think there will be a very aggressive effort to get to the bottom of this.
Do you have any concerns that other media outlets were getting sources before the indictment even came through?
Sure. The Attorney General herself said she had no idea this was even going on. In fact, the media reported it first. The media reported that information was coming straight from a grand juror about this. All of that very, very concerning. We certainly expect the grand jury process to be conducted with dignity. We expect it to be conducted in respect for the secrecy of the grand jury. That's the whole the precept behind a grand jury, and I expect a further investigation into those leaks.
What about Judge White's concern that this is New Orleans responding to threats from the Attorney General and standing up for itself?
I think the letter that the Attorney General sent speaks for itself. She is citing the law. She is legally required to uphold the law. And the Supreme Court said she was correct. That was correct. What she says about the law was correct. That was accurate. So I don't think anybody perceived this to be a threat that is what is anticipated by this particular law, which specifically talks about acts of violence or threats of violence. Again, this is a lot of theater, and I really think that this will end up exposing a lot of things that perhaps needed to be exposed.
Do you agree with the governor when he calls this building a kangaroo court, and ultimately do you think that the Attorney General will ever turn herself in?
Well, I think the Attorney General is going to do whatever the law requires her to do. She's going to file emergency motions at this time to try to stay the proceedings, just because there are so many conflicts of interest here. I mean, we have a special prosecutor here who is also being represented by the Attorney General, has a financial interest in that representation. They were in court just last week. She has reached out to the Attorney General's office with concern about that representation now recently, which shows she has some concerns about whether or not she, in fact, herself admits there's a conflict here. So that that is very, very problematic. And I agree with the governor. I don't think anybody's going to look at this and not believe that we have a kangaroo court. I think, you know, it's really a shame as we see crime go down that we have to now question the integrity of what's happening in the process of our grand jury investigations. That's very, very concerning. This was the end of this grand jury's time period. We don't know how many cases they oversaw. We don't know how many communications grand jurors were having with the public on other very serious crimes. Remember, cases that are required to go before a grand jury are cases where a mandatory life sentence is required. Those are our most serious crimes in New Orleans. We really don't want grand jurors being tampered with, whether by politicians or by the public, and without a doubt, that has happened here. So that will have an effect on all of the criminal prosecutions. It's certainly fair to say that this is a kangaroo court at this point.
Do you believe what they say, that the grand jury did this on their own?
That would be a shock to everybody in terms of whether a grand juror really instigated this on their own. It would be very, very rare. I've never seen that happen. Whether a grand juror said something, that may have happened. Maybe they had mentioned something in passing about a news story at the time. But we certainly know grand jurors are guided by the prosecution. So they're not going to be taken to this well to drink unless they're guided there by a prosecutor. So I don't believe that any grand juror went out of their way insisting on this particular investigation and insisted on an indictment either. I think that they were directed in that way, and I think we'll find out who exactly was in direct communication with the grand juror and what exactly was the motive there.
So you do believe that we'll get down to who actually kind of gave the idea for the grand juror?
I certainly hope so. I think all efforts will be made to do that. You know, we can't force anybody to say anything, but I think that there will be significant oversight into how this came about, because look, if I'm indicted by this grand jury on any other charge, I would have some questions, and if I was their lawyer, I would have some questions. What is going on in this, as we said, kangaroo court? How many other people have grand jurors spoken to outside of their group, their particular grand jury? Those are very legitimate questions that I would be asking if I had been indicted by this grand jury.
Could there be any penalties if someone's found?
Sure, it's against the law to violate the secrecy of a grand jury, and it's against the law for any public official to engage in that behavior as well. And I think that those are some of the things that have been very concerning to the Attorney General. Aside from the fact that this indictment really it's not supported by the law or the elements of this particular crime, I think even bigger than that, she will have a concern about what's actually happening here in their grand jury process, and she's required to do that. That's part of her role as well. So that's going to be a separate and aside, and that's alarming. That's going to be alarming. That should be alarming to everybody, whether it's a prosecutor in any other part of the state or whether it's a criminal defense attorney. Everybody should be very, very concerned about that.
How should taxpayers feel when the city's already facing a budget crisis when we have a special grand jury investigation?
Yeah, that's exactly. You know, look, we are at the point where our budget is so bad that is basically every headline we see. Businesses closing down, people leaving the city, all of those things really force us to ask very serious questions about what we're expending our resources on. When we see a special grand jury being formed, a special prosecutor being named, court resources being spent on something like this, then it should be very concerning to the public when we have very, very serious issues to be addressing in the city. I have to say, though, at the end of the day, I do think maybe this will bring to light some more serious things that probably needed to be addressed. And I think that's why we see the press being locked out of some of these events.
Do you believe this is related to former DA Leon Cannizzaro and his role that just ended in Attorney General Murrill's office?
I don't see any connection. I think that this is more linked to political, an attempt to make some political, sort of like a 5-minute fame on the Calvin Duncan issue with the clerk of court. I think that that's what we see here. Everybody's sort of, using Calvin Duncan for personal political interests, and unfortunately they've weaponized the criminal justice system, and unfortunately for them it could result in some serious allegations about how we see criminal justice in the city of New Orleans right now.
But didn't the governor and the attorney general start that with the action to, through the legislature to remove Mr. Duncan before he was able to take office, but after he was elected with 68% of the vote.
Correct. So the legislation was to consolidate the courts, to put Orleans in line with the rest of the state. That had long been legislation that had been discussed since, I believe it was the late 80s, about consolidating the courts. Orleans was the only parish that had a separate civil and criminal district court amidst the budget crisis. It was obviously it seemed like the time to consolidate those courts. That sparked the outrage of consolidating the courts because in the legislation it named Chelsea Napoleon, the clerk with the longer tenure, as the remaining clerk. And so I think that we saw after that, really some of our local politicians stepping up on that soapbox, using the Calvin Duncan story to elevate themselves a little bit and this narrative. And I really think that's what it is. It's a weaponization of the criminal justice system, but stemming from legislation that was really long overdue and smart fiscally.
Considering the fact that Judge Roche's position was allegedly saved in recent legislation, how do you take everything that happened today?
Well, I think Judge Roche is not exempt from when I say people are trying to utilize the system for personal politics. I think he's in for a difficult judicial race. He's going to be facing Judge Rhonda Good Douglas, and I think that potentially that this is something he would like to see benefit him by taking on the Attorney General. Unfortunately, I think he really didn't cross his T's and dot his I's in that process. We see some major mistakes here. He certainly has conflicts of interest for himself. I mean, we know that he was recently caught conducting fake trials. He has cases pending before him that are the Attorney General's cases to be prosecuted. And then he really fails to do his due diligence in determining that Lori White would not have been free of conflict in being appointed a special prosecutor here. So, very, very unfortunate missteps by Judge Roche here.
Could you repeat your name and title, please? I missed it at the beginning.
My name is Laura Canizero Rodrigue, and I'm representing the Attorney General.
And Laura, you made some allegations both against the judge as well as Lori White. Is there any concern there that, you guys don't have the facts yet of what could have actually happened?
We're using the information that we have came directly from former Judge Lori White herself. She has reached out to the Attorney General's office, and so that information isn't speculative. It's coming straight from her. So I don't think there's any concern that those facts are wrong unless she's going to admit that she lied there. And the issues stated by the conflict are fact. They're documented facts. So I think there are more facts that haven't come out yet, and we look forward to seeing those. And I won't speculate as to what those are. I won't go on the record on those yet, but I think that we all know that there's more to come here, and it's really a sad day for criminal justice in the city of New Orleans.
Are you also angry, Laura?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you also angry?
Well, look, as a former prosecutor, I'm angry to see this happening. This is not how we use the criminal justice system. This is very, very sad. It could affect a lot of prosecutions here. We expect jurors to come into the city of New Orleans and think that the system is working fairly, and that the people representing the state of Louisiana are not doing anything wrong. And this will really go to the credibility of the system. That's very, very disappointing for all of us who work in this building or who have worked in this building. It's very disappointing, I'm sure, to some of the judges here who work very hard and really go out of their way to make sure that fairness and the press is allowed to see what's going on. So disappointing on a lot of fronts. I don't think that this particular judge, Judge Roche or Judge Lori White, necessarily represent everybody in this building, but it's certainly disappointing, and I hate to see what effect it will have on criminal justice in the city. Thank you all.
One more question. Do you think that there was a reason the media was left in the dark on this?
I think that they are. I think there are things that they have concerns about, and I think that that will come to light, and I hope the media does their job to that respect.
She says they're concerned about the safety of the grand jury is why they were doing this, even though the law is clear in Code 383.
I think saying you have concerns about the safety of the grand jury is somewhat ironic given the fact that you're leaking direct conversations of the grand jury to the public. To me, that would raise much more safety concern about a grand juror. If I'm a grand juror and I'm being told that everything that I'm saying or deliberating about is secret, and I find out that people are running out and telling the public, that has serious repercussions. Imagine being on a grand jury sitting on a murder trial. How do you think that plays out when you go into the public and the public is made aware of maybe who was on the grand jury or what was being said before they indict a murderer? Those have serious consequences. So safety of a grand jury, to me, this is not the case, especially given the fact that they're leaking grand jury information. So I don't believe that. I also was told, and maybe you could verify, it's a $400,000 bond, is my understanding. Is that accurate?
I believe that's what she said.
So a $400,000 bond, remember, and you guys can do a little research out there, we're not seeing that on crimes of violence in the city of New Orleans, okay? So really think about that and apply that and ask yourselves, you know, what does that say about the city of New Orleans in terms of criminal justice? What message are we sending to the people, not only in New Orleans, but outside of New Orleans? As New Orleans goes and begs the state of Louisiana for money, hundreds of millions of dollars, they'll be back there in a couple of weeks. And this is sort of, as the governor said, the kangaroo court we expect here in the city. There are consequences for that. And so, you know, the bond, locking the press out, setting a $400,000 bond when we're not seeing that on armed robberies, you know, that certainly says what the motives are here, and I think the rest will speak for itself. Thank you all.
Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
Stuff is flying, love.
So there you heard from Laura Canizaro Rodrigue from the Attorney General's office. We did ask about her father, Leon Canizaro, the former DA, who has had many famous battles with former Judge Lori White, who is the special prosecutor in this matter. You heard Ms. Rodrigue saying that they consider this a kangaroo court, that they don't believe that Judge Leon Roche followed the proper procedure, that there were grand jury leaks. And then we have it all culminate with our investigative producer, Danny Monteverdi, trying to get access under the canons, under the criminal code, to get access to what should be open court for a grand jury return of an indictment, and he was handcuffed. Our attorney for our station was also handcuffed. They were then released and not charged, but this is very concerning, and we heard from Ms. Rodrigue there. We heard from Judge White basically saying that that's not up to her, that was the deputies who were guarding the courthouse, courtroom doing that because the press refused to leave when they were ordered to do so. Again, we were just lodging our complaint and our concern because it appeared to be violating the Code of Criminal Conduct.
Can you take me back to that moment whenever they did start putting people in handcuffs? How exactly did that transpire? And I heard Judge White say that people were looking through the windows at the grand jury. Can you clarify that at all?
Well, again, the grand jury room may have been something where people could see where it was, but I don't think anybody was violating anything. It happened to be actually across from a snack bar where people were going in and out. I can't tell you about the specifics of what happened when Danny Monteverdi was handcuffed because I wasn't inside at the time. I'd come out to get prepared to do this live report. So, but what I do know from talking to Danny is that he's very upset that he was just following our procedure for lodging a complaint. He was ignored, and then he was put in handcuffs by deputies who, whether they were doing that at the direction of the judge, we don't know, but Canon Code of Criminal Procedure Article 383 specifically says that when a grand jury indictment is handed up, it should be in open court. We've been to many courtrooms where the grand jury indictment is handed up in open court, and that was not done in this case. So we had to wait until Judge Lori White came outside to tell us exactly what happened. We didn't know whether the indictment was a true bill or a no true bill. This grand jury could have refused to charge Attorney General Liz Murrill. They did charge her with 16 counts, and we did hear that from Judge White when she came out. But again, we weren't able to get that information at the moment that it happened, as should be the case under the Code of Criminal Procedure.
David, I know we're going to reset here at 4 o'clock in just a few minutes, and we're going to come back to you and talk to you a little bit more. But before we go, I do kind of want to bring this back to basics, because we've been hearing a lot from attorneys over the last few minutes here, over the last 30 minutes here. Can we talk about what the 16 count indictment focuses on? What is the case here? What is the alleged violation?
These are 16 counts that go against they go against the Attorney General based on letters that she sent to 5 city council members, the mayor, Helena Moreno, and the district attorney, Jason Williams, where she essentially informed them that they could be removed from office and charged with a misdemeanor called the usurpation of office if they made moves to install an interim clerk of court, and arguing that that was a new position, while the legislature had passed a law that said that that was not a new position, that Chelsea Richard Napoleon, the civil clerk, would then become the unified clerk of court for the whole parish of Orleans, which would then eliminate Calvin Duncan's position that he was elected to previously, but with 68% of the vote. So that was the issue. The local officials, Mayor Moreno, DA Williams, and the 5 council members who voted to take that action were trying to take action to install a interim clerk of court and call for a special election to elect a new unified clerk of court. And again, that was Attorney General and the state legislature. They found at the state Supreme Court that that was not the case, that there would be a unified clerk of court, Chelsea Richard Napoleon. And then we thought it was dropped, and now these charges are brought against the Attorney General for threats.
All right, David, thank you so much. I know that we're going to learn a lot more here, especially as we see that indictment, which we have not really gotten our eyes on yet. We're going to see you in just a second. We're going to reset for our 4 p.m. news.
WWL-TV breaking news now.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. That breaking news: an Orleans Parish grand jury has handed up a 16-count indictment of State Attorney General Liz Murrill. This is tied to letters she sent to several New Orleans officials as they pushed back against the new laws overhauling the clerk of court's office. WWL Louisiana Chief Investigative Reporter David Hammer joins us now live with details. David, we've been with you for about the last 40 minutes here, and we've heard from attorneys on both sides. Can you tell me, just in a nutshell, what happened in the courtroom today? What are we dealing with?
Well, Devin, we don't know exactly what happened in the courtroom when the grand jury handed up this 16-count indictment against Attorney General Liz Murrill, because the media was kicked out of the courtroom. Our investigative producer, Danny Monteverdi, was handcuffed because he was trying to lodge a complaint and a dispute of that move. But what we do know now from Judge Lori White, the special prosecutor, is that they've charged Attorney General Liz Murrill with 16 counts, essentially of public intimidation and other related charges, because she had threatened to have the Mayor Helena Moreno, DA Jason Williams, and 5 council members potentially charged with crimes and removed from office.